Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Daniel, and I'm the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance. And I'm great. It's great to be here with you this afternoon, or whenever you're watching this webinar. I'm here with Joe Levy and Wendy Nather, and I'll let them introduce themselves in just a second. But today we're going to talk about the cyber poverty line and why that's important and what we can do about it. So let me turn to the other folks on the webinar today and let them introduce themselves. So Joe, over to you.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to be joining you and Wendy today. I'm Joe Levy. I'm the CEO of the cybersecurity company Sophos. I've been with Sophos for about 10 years now. Recently stepped into the CEO position. Prior to that, spent about 9 years as the Chief Technology Officer. Great to be with you today.
Wendy.
Hi, I'm Wendy Nather. I've been a CISO in the public and private sectors. I've been an industry analyst, and I was a research director at the retail ISAC. And I'm really excited to have this discussion today.
Great. Well, why don't we just dive right in and let's start by defining the concept of the cyber poverty line. And Wendy, I'm going to kick this over to you because you're the one who coined this term. So, what do we actually mean when we use the term cyber poverty line?
Well, I kind of define it as the line underneath which uh, an organization is not able to secure itself. And that's for a variety of reasons. There are a lot of dynamics in play, just like with regular poverty. Now, I should stop here and say that I know that there are some people who object to the word poverty. I think mostly because some see it as derogatory, and I don't see it that way. But it's fair. I coined it to try to describe just how complicated it is a problem to solve. And if somebody has a better phrase out there that captures that, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. Joe, what about from your perspective on the use of that term?
I love the socioeconomic framing. I think it gives people a good and an important handle on how to explore the topic. I've been referring to it for the better part of a decade, always with attribution to Wendy for it. But yeah, I see it very similarly. And for those of us who have done cybersecurity for our entire careers, we're operating in service of trying to solve the problem. But basically, we tend to think of it in terms of financial resources, and it's not always just financial resources. And in fact, the foundation of it is rooted a little more deeply in just the knowledge and the judgment to be able to put together and then to operationalize good plans around risk management. So like it's not a matter of which cybersecurity product do I go out and buy, and am I buying the most expensive, which is expected to produce the best result for me? But how do I actually put together a strategy? How do we get approval for the budgets within our business and from our boards of directors? How do we undertake the recruiting and the hiring and the training and the retention of the staffing that's going to be responsible for the operationalization over time? And then it's also accompanied by this like perilous lack of resources that just produces this vicious cycle. And there's this downward sucking of that effect that accompanies it. And you could see it manifest itself in various ways, like the affordability of cyber insurance premiums or the availability of cyber insurance in some cases.
Right.
Victimization could be an extinction event for businesses. There's a lot of very powerful analogies to poverty in the real world when you think of the terminology of the cybersecurity poverty line. And I think that all of the pitfalls are painfully analogous.
Yeah, and I think, another thing that I think of when you think about that term, right, is that um, for when you draw on the socioeconomic, analogy, right, someone who's living in poverty is often forced to make trade-offs between things that like other people would see as necessities, right? So it's kind of like, well, do we pay the doctor bill or do we eat this week? It's sort of and those are the kinds of trade-offs that you make when you're in those kinds of limited resource situations. And I think that's what we're also sort of drawing to here is that businesses and organizations that are below this poverty line, they may even recognize that they should be, spending some on cybersecurity, but it just can't compete with the other priorities that they have because otherwise, to your point, Joe, they go extinct, right, as a business. And the I think so. That's why I think this is such a powerful analogy. Um, but I also think, how does this concept sort of shape you were starting to allude to it, Joe, but how does this concept really sort of shape the cybersecurity landscape?
So there's some pretty powerful economics behind the whole thing, and I think it begins with this prevailing and unfortunately persistent intuition in the industry that it's hard to grow a business or to grow a business profitably when you're servicing the smaller segments of the market where you tend to see the intersection of the cohorts or the segmentation of a market and the occurrence of operation below the poverty line. So it's primarily, but not entirely or exclusively, the small to medium business and the mid market. Like you imagine that the global 2000, they're always going to be better resourced. They're going to have bigger budgets. They're going to have better staffing. They're going to have access to the best advisors and the best technologies. So this is an economic problem at its root, and the economics are challenging because it's obvious that if you're a company that's trying to service 25,000 customers of 200 seats each, it's going to be very different than servicing 200 customers of 25,000 seats each. They're both 5 million seats when you do the math, but the operating characteristics are very, very different. And that's across the entire business. It means obviously your R&D and the way that you design and develop your products and your services, and their accessibility to that segment of the market. Like if you assume that everyone who's going to be operating your technology is necessarily an expert, you're probably not making the right kinds of technologies for that segment of the market that operates below the poverty line. Probably more important than the technology itself, because accompanying that is the assumption that nobody wants to buy a mediocre product. Nobody wants to buy a product that's been dumbed down in some way. So the assumption must begin with you're building products and you're building services that are designed to produce good outcomes in either population. And where the primary difference in the company and organization comes from, I think, is more in the go-to-market and the ability to market to that segment of cybersecurity buyers who are probably less well equipped to make good decisions. Cybersecurity is a classic market for lemons. It's very difficult for
Yes.
the common to differentiate between what is a credible claim and what is not a credible claim, what is a good technology or a good service and not a good technology or a service. So there's a different way that you have to communicate with the markets. There's a different way that you have to reach the markets. Another example would be that if you look at most of the startup space in cybersecurity today, they generally start as a VC-backed operation, venture capital-backed operation, and they build a direct sales organization. And a direct sales organization is designed to help them reach the global 2000, but it doesn't give them any kind of a facility to be able to reach the small to medium business or the mid-market. So that means building a channel and making the multi-year investment in that. So I could go on about the economics of it, but it just ends up with these very, very different manifestations of businesses that are designing solutions for the enterprise versus solutions for the mid-market and the SMB space.
Yeah.
And there's a problem with capabilities that organizations have. For example, I was getting a CT scan one time, and I asked the technician, "When was last time you patched this scanner?" And they said, "Oh, it's like 10 years old. It's so old that it can't even hold any functional patches anymore, much less security ones." So there are things that organizations buy that they expect to keep for 20 years. They're not going to swap them out just because security believes that they need to be updated. And there are all sorts of examples of that sort of thing where you're going to hold on to things for as long as they continue to operate. And, or, look at aviation. You don't get to fail fast when you're in aviation. Um, that there are just so many constraints that organizations have to operate under where they cannot do the things that we consider conventional wisdom for security.
Yeah, I think the term that like popped into my head when you were talking, Joe, was the idea of food deserts. How like there are swaths of cities where there are just no grocery stores, right? And it's because the market economics don't appear to work for, grocery store chains to be in those sections of the city. So you end up with only these convenience stores, and then people end up not eating as well as they should because they don't have access to the fresh produce and other things like that. So even if they know that that's what they're supposed to be doing, it's not there for them to. And even if they have a commitment to doing that, it's not available to them. And so that's what I was thinking about when you were talking about that. And then, Wendy, I think, when you're talking about the capabilities there, like we still like we've got a model for how like software works and how security should work, and it's all sort of based on business technology that is changing extremely rapidly, where you switch out systems and you depreciate systems over a 5-year window at most, and that just doesn't work for a lot of other technology types, and we haven't really thought about adjusting our again, our market to that. But I wanted to kind of ask a question here, like to kind of flip this around. I mean, if you're part of that global 2000, if you're a large bank or you're a large power company or whatever, large industrial conglomerate, why do you actually care about organizations that fall below the line? Why is this an issue?
I would say, first of all, it's because there are enormous ripple effects. Uh, no matter what size the organization is, first of all, there are also plenty of large global organizations that do fall below the cyber poverty line for various reasons. They cannot secure themselves the way that we believe that they should. But also, there's been some great research by Scientia and Risk Recon, a subsidiary of MasterCard, where they looked at the ripple effects. For example, the Blackbaud ransomware incident, where most people had not heard of Blackbaud before this happened, but they calculated that it affected as many as 1,000 other organizations, a lot of them nonprofits, which are the other critical infrastructure. And so even large organizations can be affected by insecurity, and, at lower levels, especially in their own supply chains. Probably a lot of their suppliers fall below the poverty line, and it's not something that that they may be looking at, especially in the public sector when you're using smaller contractors and historically underutilized businesses. They tend to be smaller and have fewer resources. So there's just a whole wide swath out there that does affect even the largest ones because nobody's an island. They have never been, but it's clearer now more than ever that we all have to secure ourselves together. We have to look at cyber civil defense.
Yeah, and I think the way that I sort of also say it to try to sum that up is kind of your risk is my risk, right? When you live in an interconnected network, to some degree your risk is affected by everybody else's risk, whether you like it or not. Joe, you want to sort of expand on that?
Yeah, completely agree that we're way past the point of operating models that confer the benefit of isolation. Everything is disconnected with everything else at this point. And sometimes the interconnections and the interdependencies are so complex that we can't even model them. And we discover them the hard way. That happens far too often. And Wendy, your point about Blackbaud is a really interesting one because I think it's probably a non-obvious example of the concentrations of risk that exist within the industry, where you get these keys to the kingdom levels of access. And we tend to think of it in primarily the MSP, the managed service provider world today, where there have been a string of compromises of like RMM, remote monitoring and management, or PSA, professional services and automation vendors over the years. I think SolarWinds is probably the most memorable of all of these. But there are other ways where this concentration of risk can occur, and they occur within supply chains that you don't always think of. Like when you think about the collection of vendors that you have as a business, you don't always know what their onboarding was like at the time that they became a vendor. So even if you have the best practices for vendor onboarding today, if you have a vendor who has been around for quite a long time, maybe your vendor onboarding practices were not as rigorous back then, but they've just been in your vendor ecosystem. Maybe they themselves are using other vendors who are upstream of them or downstream of them in the delivery of their services to you. It's virtually impossible to model the complexity of the interdependency at this point. And it does create this concentrated risk where these kinds of levels of access, whether it's for monitoring tools or whether it's for access to the platforms, the CRM platforms that NGOs operate on, there are thousands of examples of this across the entire globe.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that systemic risk issue is really big, right? And it manifests in a whole bunch of different ways, right? Which is, you know, um, I mean, to your point, Wendy, like if you have, something where you've got an infection that actually affects a whole bunch of people. I mean, there was I mean, the U.S. government announced the takedown of, Flax Typhoon back in September, which was largely working off of like small office, home office routers, right? These were,
Yes.
they weren't getting a hold of, some big company server and using that to do what they wanted to do. They were, compromising thousands of small devices here and there to do what they wanted to do. And again, those are probably organizations that, a lot of those people probably weren't even aware that a router was something that you could patch, or that you even should. It's it's even kind of crazy that we would expect people to know that. I mean, it's kind of like expecting everybody to be their own car mechanic. I mean, you know,
Yeah, exactly. And probably most of the routers work just fine. Even though they
yep,
were infected, they were being held by a threat actor, for particular purposes. They wouldn't have noticed. And actually, Black Lotus Labs and Lumen did some really interesting research into this, and they found that because a lot of the malware was trying to remain persistent in memory, one of the best areas where um, those small office, home office routers were escaping this was in Colombia, where they had regular power outages, and that would wipe the infection, and the threat actor would have to go back and recapture them afterwards. So you see the really interesting dynamic of how these things can be captured and used without the actual owners or users of this infrastructure even being aware of it.
yeah. And I think you raised an interesting point too, that like we're not just talking about like for-profit businesses here, right? That we're actually also talking about NGOs. This is actually an area that CTA, we've spent some time talking a lot about. We wrote a report on it last spring, about the cyber threats that NGOs face, and they have another problem, which, when um, donors don't like to spend money on, what they perceive as overhead, right? And so cybersecurity is very much perceived as overhead. So even if a NGO, again, we come back to, part of the reason they're below the poverty line is because even if they want to spend on cybersecurity, they're often hindered by their own donors who don't want the money being allocated to that. I mean, it sets up a really like tough dynamic if you're an international, particularly international NGOs.
That is really tough. And there are organizations like Sightline Security, where I'm on the board, that are trying to help these nonprofits figure out how to secure themselves, how to assess their level of security. But you really have to be careful to frame it in terms of their mission, because that's what's most important to them. It's not necessarily, are we compliant with this or that, or the, this
Right.
framework. It's what's going to get in the way of our mission. What are our risks?
Yeah. And how do you frame it as if you want your dollars to actually, if you want your dollars and the program dollars to actually get to the recipient, then just like you have to spend a little bit of it on some salaries,
Yeah.
for people running it, you're going to have to spend a little bit on, cybersecurity, or otherwise it'll never get there. Um, Joe, I mean, we haven't really talked about this, but I mean, I could imagine some government agencies or some governments falling into this category too. Certainly, when I think about local governments here in this country, that could be the case.
Yeah, I think the categories that are probably most exposed to this, just again, based on the mapping of size, it's going to be SLED, which is state, local, and education, and SLTT, state, local, tribal, and territorial. So they tend to operate with the greatest budgetary constraints relative to, say, federal government organizations. And even in the federal government, that I wouldn't say that there's immunity to operating below the poverty line. Just typically and characteristically, I think we see this kind of mapping more often. Um, to the point that you raised, Wendy, about the work that you're doing with Sightline, for example, like just a plug for public service for this kind of work. Like many of us who've been in the industry for a long time, we often have the opportunity to step into advisory positions, to step into board positions. That kind of service is really important. Bringing the sort of expertise that you do to organizations that are helping NGOs make better decisions. Oftentimes, it's not a matter of they don't want to spend the money; it's that they don't know that they need to spend the money. So, education and having representation on a board, I think it's awesome that you're doing that sort of work.
No, I totally agree, and I think you know, it's this interesting. I think it's this interesting dynamic that like this industry, the NGO space is really just now starting to come to grips with some of these problems. And what's interesting to me is that for a lot of the international NGOs, right, they actually face a problem that is more akin to what some really big organizations face, in the sense that they face all of the normal sort of low-level cybercrime that's out there. But they're also targeted by like nation states that normally sort of in the for-profit business world would never bother with a dry cleaner, right? You know, but they're going to go after that NGO because they see it as a threat for whatever reason. And so suddenly you've got these NGOs that have like sort of the resources that that like a dry cleaner might have, but we're expecting them to take on the Russians or the Chinese or some other nation state level actor. And it really creates this power imbalance in there, which again comes back to the analogy of the sort of the cyber poverty line. Which actually kind of now leads me to, kind of the second half of our discussion here, which is really like, I want to talk about like, okay, so we've got this problem and we've talked about some of the structural issues, you know, some of the economic drivers, sort of why this problem exists. We talked a little bit about, why we actually care about this problem. But I want to talk a little bit about like, what should we actually do about it? And maybe we can start from sort of the cybersecurity industry point of view. And we've talked a little bit about some of these, but maybe, Joe, just start with you about like sort of what are some of the things that we think the industry should do to try to address some of these problems?
I think it begins with the recognition that there is an opportunity to build successful and thriving cybersecurity businesses while tailoring your solutions to this traditionally underserved segment of the market. I alluded to some of the characteristics here. Nobody wants to build a product that's been dumbed down. people want to have the best technology at their service. A good tradesperson wants to be able to use the best tools. It's a pretty reasonable set of expectations. So it absolutely does not mean neutralize the effectiveness of a technology so that you could sell it down market to those who might not have the biggest budgets and the biggest staff. So the operationalization component of it, or to coin a very awkward phrase, the operationalizability of it, the ability for buyers in this segment to clearly identify the messaging that is coming from the vendors, to have the assistance from the vendors and from the channel that the vendors work with to be able to make better decisions, and to have a better than average set of odds to be able to produce a more successful outcome with these investments. One of the ways that this most recently has been manifesting itself within the industry is this shift toward a services adoption model, or the combination of products and services where vendors are increasingly delivering their technology offerings in service packages. I think that kind of consumability is a trend that is beginning to drive some improvements in this segment, just because it's making those good outcomes a little more attainable and a little more accessible. Now, that of course, it takes some convincing. Businesses must convince themselves that there is shareholder benefit in this. Ultimately, most of the businesses that are operating today are operating for the benefit of shareholders, whether it's the proprietors of the business itself, or whether it's a set of investors. So I think the investment community is slowly beginning to wake to this as well. If you look at like the venture space, for example, I think there are a few venture capital operators in cybersecurity today. Force Point Capital is a good example, I think, that recognizes that there is indeed an opportunity to return investment to limited partners by making smart investments in clever cybersecurity startups like Huntress, for example, that are focusing on this segment of the market. So like I want to be careful to not make this an advertisement about Sophos. It is in fact our raison d'etre, but there are a number of other examples, I think, of what I would call good actors in the industry. Cybersecurity itself it's a pretty noble effort. And then I think there's an incremental level of nobility for those who are choosing to take the harder road of servicing the segment of the market that, again, has been historically ignored.
Yeah, and I think, your reference to the market for lemons, there's some great work that's been done to actually, sort of connect that to that Akerhof concept of the market for lemons, right? And to me, one of the other things that the cybersecurity industry should do is really start to figure out and embrace ways of measuring the efficacy of the products that we offer, right? And we shouldn't be afraid to figure out how to get that economic model of testing, and sort of where people can have confidence that the products actually do what they say they're going to do. And I think that would also go a long way, right? Because I mean, it's hard even for, I think, and Wendy, I think you would agree with this, like it's hard even if you're an expert in this stuff to like judge the efficacy of a lot of products. And even for a lot of, CISOs and things, like that's a big challenge, like actually even trying to figure out like how do I even evaluate this? So let alone if you're not a full-time CISO, like doing this, again, for organizations that are below the poverty line, you've got to have some level of assurances there.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was an analyst at 451 Research, I started doing some research into what's the bare minimum, what's the minimum baseline that somebody should have? And the question I posed to a number of security professionals is, okay, I'm a first time, I'm a CISO, it's my first day on the job in an organization that's never done security before. What should I buy? That was it. What should I buy? And I got answers that range from as few as 4 types of technologies that they named to 31 technologies. And you can imagine that the ones who named 31 technologies worked for a bank because they can buy one of everything.
Right.
But nobody could agree And once I averaged everything out and kind of normalized and everything, it looked an awful lot like a PCI DSS shopping list. But this is a real problem if you are a CISO and you're sitting in front of a blank Excel spreadsheet and you have to build a budget and go, okay, what should I buy in what order? That isn't even the issue you raised of if I buy something, is it actually going to work? Or even if it does what it says it's going to do, is that enough? Because
Enough, right?
it's not just technology that builds security, it's the people and processes and circumstances and constraints and all sorts of other things that can get in the way. So you're right, we do not know what works in security. And if we don't know, how do we know if it's even affordable for these organizations? So that's a really big fundamental problem. And I've done some research on it and security outcomes, but we need a whole lot more because if we can't even answer that, where are we? What are we going to do?
Yeah, and I think it even comes back to like there's people want like rules of thumb, but like it's like, could I tell you that like, oh, well, you can sort of look and see in the companies that spend, 5% of their IT budget on security do well.
Yeah.
And like you can't do any of that. I mean,
No, no, you can't. If you have a really tiny budget, 5% is not going to buy you even one product.
like,
It's
right.
I hate that percentage model. I think it's ridiculous.
Yeah. And but I also think that like, we also don't have, sort of the standards of care or, in the accounting field, you have sort of generally accepted accounting principles, right? And even if you're a small business, like you still got to follow the generally accepted accounting principles. And everybody sort of knows this. And, you know, and there's an entire accounting market that is dedicated to small and medium businesses, and they've figured out how to make that sort of market work, and we just haven't done that, to Joe's point, in the cybersecurity area. And I think that's part of where we need to get to, is this kind of idea of generally accepted cybersecurity practices, and we need sort of that's your table stakes for sort of being an organization and participating. But I think this gets at, another topic that I wanted to get to, which is, sort of what are some of the public policy issues that we need to be, pursuing to, or some of the public policies that we should be pursuing to address the cyber poverty line, as well. And Wendy, maybe I'll start over on your side with that.
Yeah, I mean, I was really encouraged to see in the latest version of the National Cybersecurity Strategy, the reference to maybe moving some of the burden of cybersecurity from those small organizations that are not in any position to secure themselves and place it on larger organizations that can afford it. I felt that was culturally a really interesting movement because here in the United States, we tend to just assume that everybody should be pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps. And that attitude can get in the way of us helping to secure, the common good and adopting the attitude that we're all in this together. Whereas in some other countries, they're doing a better job of that. So policy-wise, I would love to see some more of that, where can we settle this in places where it's more doable? But of course, identifying the linchpins for cybersecurity in our infrastructure and in our society is not that straightforward. As you mentioned, that there are all sorts of complicated dependencies where we're not going to find out what something was relying on until somebody yoinks it out and the whole thing falls down. So yeah, but more research along these lines is sorely needed.
Yeah, and I think this idea of, shifting the burden, realigning the burden, we've, in essence, the way that I think about it is we've pushed the security burden all the way out to the edge, right? All the way out to the end user. And some of what we're doing is talking about, as societies, can we realign some of that burden? And those are policy choices, right? It is not of necessity that it's not a law of the universe, like physics or math, that like some of this operates the way that it does. And, I have to come back to like, what other product do the manufacturers of like bear no liability for how the product performs? And oh, by the way, you don't even get to buy it. You just license it from them. Like it's kind of a crazy market when you think about that. And we don't do that with like almost anything else. And so to me, I think all of this sort of says we've got to rethink how we're doing this. Now, just like you don't say, like people are responsible for locking their car or locking their doors. Like there's always going to be some burden that is placed on the end user, and that's okay. What we're just well, I think what we're talking about here is like how do you take some of the stuff that really actually needs to belong to, more centralized organizations and have them shoulder that burden and enable the end user to focus on just locking the doors and the windows and having a car alarm instead of, or having an alarm system instead of having to do all of the work themselves. But Joe, I mean, do you have a perspective on kind of that more public policy work? I mean, I just threw the grenade with the software liability thing in there, but I mean, there are other things as well.
So I'll start by attempting to answer your question. What other industry do we allow that? Maybe the pharmaceutical industry. No, I'm just kidding. I had to get that in there. I'll start by saying that anytime you start talking about policy, whether it's regulations or laws or fines, like you have to start off with a general disclaimer of I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And
Right.
Michael, you totally get that. So now one of the problems that we're running into is we're starting to see more and more regulation coming, and the issue is that it can get fragmented, it can get
Yep.
confusing. We did a webinar on CIRCIA a while ago, and we talked about that in the context of CIRCIA. And so, like, if you just look at recent regulation related to cybersecurity, which I think is net beneficial, but like the SEC disclosure rule, CIRCIA, I mean, this is just over the past couple of years. There's probably going to be more of it, but there's going to need to be a kind of harmonization that happens here. And I think we're in the early stages of that. I think there's a Senate bill that's designed to address that now, and hopefully it begins to get a handle on these things. But where I'm really optimistic is primarily in the work that CISA is doing now, and that like I think a lot of people have heard of Secure by Design, and Secure by Design is gradually beginning to shift the liability to a software liability regime, where the vendors who are writing the software, which are introducing the defects, which are then being exploited by attackers, there needs to be some accountability. We can't continue to allow the shipment of these egregious violations of vulnerability classes that should have stopped existing 10 years ago. And there is going to have to be a market dynamic that is going to drive this. And what we've begun exploring with Secure by Design is the supply side. And a number of vendors have signed up to the pledge. Sophos was one of the signatories for that at the RSA conference earlier this year. We take this very, very seriously, and it's great to see other vendors taking it seriously as well. But until we see the demand side for it, I don't think that the supply is going to begin to make a difference in the market. And recently, CISA has introduced the counterpart, Secure by Demand. And now the combination of those two things, I think, are going to begin to produce the market dynamic that is necessary. Because when you can get procurement offices talking about cybersecurity rather than just negotiating the best possible price from the lowest bidder, then you begin to change the way that vendors are permitted to operate, because now there's skin in the game. So I'm very, very encouraged by it. I think Secure by Design, Secure by Demand are some of the best things that have come out of government when it comes to actually improving the problem for us. And I'm encouraged to see the kind of progress that we make as a result.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Especially Secure by Demand helps the other case, which is part of this cyber poverty, that smaller organizations don't have the influence with their suppliers that larger ones do, and the government does. I mean, if I'm working for, a Fortune 1000, I can say to my suppliers, you need to fix that. But when I was working for a state agency, they would either say, well, you're the only one who's complained about this, so no, we're not fixing it, or we'll fix it if you pay us to fix it. So taking over that influence, I love that CISA is stepping up to the plate and creating that influence that the larger amount of organizations under the poverty line just can't get together.
Yeah, and I think I also think of it as kind of reducing the amount of cybersecurity that a company ultimately needs to buy,
Mhm.
right? So you reduce the price in terms of dollars, but you also reduce the price in terms of people's time and sort of effort and energy, right? All of which to drive it and make it more affordable. Um, and we're sort of saying that we're going to put some of that burden and some of that in some other places. And I think, the other piece I would just add is also moving towards that idea of secure by default, right? That you set the defaults in the right place, because we know from a whole lot of behavioral psychology that setting the defaults properly is really, really important. And so if you just have certain things turned on by default or certain things turned off by default that are particularly risky, then most of your small users and things won't go do that. And only the people who, will know to go turn that thing on, well, they'll be doing it by conscious choice and they will know the risk that they're taking most of the time and, can make a much more informed decision about that. And so I think if you start, that secure by design, secure by default, secure by demand, then you start shifting the whole ecosystem into a different state, right? And that puts us in a much better place. And I think that that is, and I take your point, Joe, about like, boy, it would be really easy to mess this up with, like ham-handed, regulations, because if you just, you remember that I spent many, many years at an agency inside the government whose job it was to tell other government agencies, like, no, that regulation's not ready. It's half baked. Go put it back in the oven. So I have a healthy degree of skepticism for that. But I do think that it's going to require that government intervention in the markets to actually make that shift. Um, I think we're coming up into the last few minutes of the webinar here, and so I just wanted to give you both a chance to kind of wrap this discussion up from your perspective, and how should we think about this? What's kind of the call to action and how people can engage and sort of move this process forward. So Wendy, maybe I'll start with you on that score.
Well, first of all, I'm really glad we were having this discussion because when I do give a talk about this, I will have people come up to me afterwards from the audience and say, yeah, that's us. Don't tell anybody. So, this is a problem that people are not going to volunteer that they have. And so I think it's incumbent on us and on organizations like the CTA and others to bring this up and to engage in these discussions with the industry, with policymakers, and also with the organizations without necessarily pinpointing that they're affected, but letting them have a seat at the table to describe what's doable and what is not doable. Because when you have Fortune 1000s helping to make policy, that is not going to help these other organizations.
Absolutely right. Yep, Joe.
Well, I just want to say it's been a great experience to have this conversation with both of you, Wendy in particular, for the person who coined the phrase to be exploring the topic with you is a real treat. Um, I think we covered a lot of ground, and I think the crux of it is that this is an economic problem, and it's going to require economic solutions. And I think the market is beginning to look at it that way, whether it's through some of the guidance that we're getting from CISA, or whether it's to the awakening that the venture cyber community has to the opportunity that really exists in servicing the underserved segment of the market in a good way. I think we're at the early days of a difference being made, and that's very, very encouraging. The other thing that I'd say is that the way that Jen Easterly frames the problem, I think, is really important to us solving what underlies all of this. Because yes, there's victimization happening, but it's probably happening primarily not because of business logic flaws, but because of software defects. And the way she expresses it is, we don't need more cybersecurity products. We need more secure products. And that's exactly the way that the industry needs to be thinking about it. There needs to be skin in the game. There needs to be consequences for continuing to ship non-secure products. There needs to be consequences for shipping products that don't have good defaults out of the box. Like we need to be making it harder for people to do the wrong thing with the products that we're shipping to them. And Jen's ultimate goal here is a world where cybersecurity is obsolete. And that sounds awesome. And it's probably going to take a little bit of time for us to get there, but I think we're starting to make progress.
Yeah, and I thank you both for taking the time to chat with me today. I always, these are the kinds of topics that I enjoy exploring as well, because they're actually the reason that I got into cybersecurity, because it was very much a realization that, like, wait a minute, this is not purely a ones and zeros problem. This is actually it's a economics problem, it's a business problem, it's a psychology problem. Oh, this is actually really interesting, from a policy perspective. But I also, I would be remiss, I think, if I also said that, I think some of this is also, we've got to change a little bit of the culture of the tech and cybersecurity industry, that we tend to act like if you don't understand what we're talking about, you're stupid. And we've got to change that. That, the there's an expertise in cybersecurity, and that is true. And there's a very deep technical expertise, and that should be, respected. But just because you don't have that expertise does not mean you're an idiot. I think that's, I think that's an aspect of the tech and IT culture that, or the IT and cybersecurity culture, that we need to change and evolve, so that we're not, so that we don't demean people, and so that people aren't as afraid, Wendy, of saying, yes, we do have a problem with this. And we do, no, I don't understand everything here, but it's your job to speak to me in English so I can understand you. Not my job to become a cybersecurity expert so I can understand you. And I think that's a big step that we need to make. But I want to thank both of you for taking the time to be on this discussion. That was really an excellent one, and I will look forward to continuing the conversation in the future. So thanks, everyone.